Hi, everyone. While we were sad not to see you in person at ALA Midwinter this year, thank you for joining us today for this very special author event. I'm Tiffany Liao, Senior Editor at Henry Holt Books for Young Readers, and I am thrilled to introduce Angeline Boulley, author of Firekeeper's Daughter, a groundbreaking new YA thriller available March 2021. Hi, Angeline. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, hello.
So,
here.
So I'm excited to dive into talking more about your inspirations behind the scenes, but I thought to sort of set the tone for the conversation, I wanted to first start with a quote from you, actually. So this is something I remember reading on your website long before we even started working together for Firekeeper's Daughter. You said that you had set out to write the book because there are simply too few stories told by and about Native Americans, especially from a contemporary viewpoint. We exist and have dynamic experiences beyond history books or stories set long ago. And that always struck such a chord with me, and it's something we've talked about over the course of editing and revising this book. And I'd love to hear if you could just talk a little bit more about that and how that might have led to your inspiration for Firekeeper's Daughter.
Well, I've heard the quote before about books serving as windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors for young readers. And growing up, I never saw myself in a book in terms of, I read a lot of mysteries and thrillers, Nancy Drew, but I was a senior in high school before I read a book that had a Native main character. And now as an author and just finding out how few books are actually featuring a Native character, and then an even fewer, smaller number of those authored by Native authors. So it's representation matters, and it's something that I feel so strongly about. And if we can tell our stories and show a variety of what being Indigenous means, my experience is going to be very different from, someone else's experience. And I think the danger when there are so few stories is that people get a skewed idea about what being Native is. And the more stories we have, the more balanced, the more nuanced, the more diverse storytelling we can convey.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, something we discussed too is, in deciding, wanting to share the stories of your community, wanting to portray the full complexity, which stories to share and which aspects to reveal and to convey. And so, one thing I know that you took extra care with was making sure that you were thoughtful about which elements of Native culture you shared and when. Can you talk a little bit more about, how you used windows at some points? And I love the term that you use, curtains, and others.
Right. So the quote by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop is about books serving as mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Dr. Debbie Reese, who does the blog American Indian Children's Literature, she has coined an additional phrase of, and sometimes those windows need curtains. And so there are definitely things that should not be shared outside of our community. For example, ceremonies. Our traditional ceremonies are things that are for our community, and so knowing what not to share is sometimes it's even more important than what to share. And so my mantra as I was writing and revising is that I write to preserve my culture and I edit to protect it. And I think that's what gets at the pulling the curtain when and fading the scene to black when Donis is going to go into the sweat lodge with her Aunt Teddy. And then the scene picks up afterwards when they're sitting at the fire and they're nourishing themselves and talking. And that's where I felt it was appropriate And of course, other writers might draw that line differently. And, I go on what my cultural teachers have taught me and what resonates with me as far as where I draw that line.
Yeah, and I know that throughout the process, you consulted a lot with your cultural elders. I know you mentioned you're like, oh, I'll need to speak to my Aunt Teddy. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that process, because I know you were sharing bits and pieces of the story. And I got to sit in on that fascinating conversation between you and Margaret Newton, who consulted on the Anishinaabe. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that informed your writing process.
Sure. I've always been so fortunate. My career after I graduated from high school has primarily been working in different tribal communities. And I've just been so fortunate that in each of those communities, there have been women that took me under their wing and befriended me and shared their culture with me, and invited me, my family, my father, to come to different community events and really welcomed me. And so I have many Aunt Teddies in different tribal communities across Michigan. And it's just good to talk about what young women need to know. We used to have coming of age ceremonies. We still do, but fewer and fewer young women know about them and participate in them. And so, in a way, this book can maybe open that door for young women from a tribal community to start asking family members, where would I learn about, this, or what maybe might their grandmother or, an auntie might have done as a rite of passage in their community. How would their community honor and recognize when a girl becomes a woman, and that coming of age, whether it's through a fasting camp or a berry fast or berry feast, different cultural traditions that help us recognize that very important stage in a young woman's life.
Absolutely. And I think that this, you're very much writing the story for, I think, young Native women, portraying their experiences. I love this full dynamic cast of characters. You have so many ways of being a Native woman, right? You see that variance and evolution, even for Donis herself. Something you said early on the editorial process that always stayed with me. Clearly, you said many wise words, and I was just like, is the care and thought with which you portray the difficult realities of what it means to be a Native woman, and the very real struggles that they encounter. You said that I want to write about trauma, not tragedy. And so with that, could you just talk a little bit more about that, and how that sort of informed the way that you were approaching these themes?
Sure. So writing about the realities that face young women in my tribal community and other communities, you want to tell a real story, and you want to get at the realities and the obstacles and the struggles that young women are facing. And but I didn't want to tell a story that was so downtrodden, because my community has so much to celebrate too. And I think that this is why representation in literature, particularly Native literature, matters so much, is because I feel like from the inside you can write about maybe the harsh realities of your community, but you do it from a loving point of view. Like, I can say things about my community that someone else might not, be able to say. And I'm also balancing the traumatic events with the parts about, our resiliency and the way that our community comes together, and the whisper networks and blanket parties and the different things that women in our community have developed to protect themselves and others from danger and predators. And I wanted to make sure that that is shown in the best light, and because that really is a community caring for one another. So yes, that was another mantra that I had, is that I was writing about trauma, but I wasn't writing a tragedy.
I think that spirit which you approach the scenes really brings something new to the thriller genre. You know, no one, it's not just a body count. There aren't just victims, right? We get their full sense of who they are, how they fit into the community. When there's a death, I reading about the mourning scene, the 4-day funeral, how a community processes that grief and trauma together. It's not just a death for shock value, right? And so I think so much of how you approach the thriller genre is really unique because you're coming at it through this lens. So I'd love to, I know something we worked on early on is, again, we're like the promise, the premise, like bringing out, enhancing those thriller elements, right? Having the breakneck turns, the shocking reveals. So how did you balance the two? How did you, as you were writing or revising and we were working together, retain the quality spirit of what you're talking about within the confines of the thriller genre?
Well, one of the best things we had, if people could see my notes from the very first phone call that we had, I mean, it was just scribbles all over the page because I couldn't keep up with how fast you were talking. And you gave me like this breakthrough of that in my first act, I was introducing so many secondary characters. And let's reserve let's reserve act one for primary characters. And you said something, you said your secondary characters would be so much more memorable as suspects. And that just flipped the way that I was structuring the story, and feeling like I had to get all of this information up front. And so that really helped me to structure what the second act needed to look like, and how interesting I could introduce these other dynamic characters, and not have it just be an info dump at in an early scene. And then too, our conversations and your editorial letter, just it helped me to make good on that promise of the premise, that here you have this young woman, Donis, who is in a difficult, intense situation of being compelled to help an investigation, and then all of the secrecy that's around that, and her wondering, who her allies are, who she can trust, what's really going on in her community that maybe she hadn't paid attention to, and really having her be this active secret squirrel, which is the term that she coins herself for. The secret squirrel was an older cartoon about this fedora wearing fedora and trench coat wearing squirrel, and he worked in the International Sneaky Service or something like that, and it was like just a cute little cartoon. But in Donis's mind, as she's learning about this investigation and what her role is going to be, she's 18 years old, and she puts it in terms that maybe is easier for her to process, instead of me, an Ojibwe girl, is going to help the FBI, a federal agency which has not been necessarily helpful to Native communities. So how can I do what I feel compelled to do? And for her, it's like, all right, secret squirrel lesson number one, and as she's getting this guidance about how to proceed as a confidential informant, she makes up these little secret squirrel rules to help her make sense of what she's got to do.
Yeah, and I think, what I love so much about Donis is that she's so wonderfully nuanced. And what makes her such a great secret squirrel is that she is pulling from all the various worlds that she occupies. She is a hockey star, she's a science nerd, she is a devoted daughter, a granddaughter. She has to figure out, how to both be with her firekeeper, her Ojibwe family, as well as the Fontaine family, her white side. And I think all this navigation, I'd love to hear a little bit more about where you have drawn from your own experiences navigating various worlds, and also whether there are any attributes where you're like, I'm giving Donna something that is wildly different, and this is going to be a character totally of my own invention.
What I want to get at is about how all these different parts of you that maybe you have to code switch, and you think of it as that you're not this, you're not enough of this or enough of that. And for Donis to realize that because she is this and that and this, she is able to be the most a very effective confidential informant. She has access that um, anyone else working undercover would not have that level of access to so many segments in her community. And her realization of that, that what she had always viewed as a detriment was actually her greatest strength. And that's something that really resonates with me, because I think if young people read a character and they can identify so closely with, to see yourself as the hero in a story is just, I think it changes how you view the world and your place in it. I would like to add that, Donis and I are both fair-skinned. We both, have a Ojibwe dad and a non-native mom. We have some similarities, but things that we have that are very different is that I've always been enrolled in my tribe. And she plays hockey and I definitely do not. And she's way better in science and chemistry, math than I could ever dream of being. So that's where we're different.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is real life inspiration, certainly, aspects of from your own experiences in your own community. But I know there's this very specific story that led to the genesis of Firekeeper's Daughter. And I'm hoping you can share with the room about this.
Sure. I'm always careful to share it because it's a spoiler, but when I was a senior in high school, one of my friends that I worked with went to a different high school, and she told me one time about, oh, there's this new guy in school and he's just your type, because unfortunately I had a type, which is foolish anyway. And so I was curious, intrigued, tell me more. And as the weeks went by, tell, hey, whatever is going on with that new guy. And then she told me, oh, you wouldn't like him after all. He doesn't play sports and he hangs out with all of the stoners. And I thought, oh, okay, yeah, that's, and then at the end of the school year, she just was stunned and told me that the guy was actually an undercover narcotics officer, and he was there to find out who the suppliers were for a local drug ring. And I remember thinking, like, oh my God, what would have happened if I would have gone to that high school? What if I would have been in classes with him? And, what if I would have liked him? Or what if he would have liked me? And then just this little spark of, what if it wasn't that he liked me, but he needed my help? Why would someone need this young woman's help? And so, that's really the seed for that story, for my story, started many years ago.
And I think that's what makes the romantic tension so juicy. It is so swoony every single time I read and got to that scene, I was always like, oh. And I think it is this like fuel of like, on the flip side, from Donna's perspective, does he like me or does he need me? And I love that like will they, won't they, that keeps simmering throughout. I think it's something that is missing from a lot of thrillers. There is this romance that does feel like very teen, very much like Donis is an 18-year-old. Jamie is an attractive, like older guy. So I love that you're able to work in those dynamics as well. And speaking of Jamie, I know that law enforcement, both on a local tribal level and on a federal level, plays heavily into this book in terms of the way that you're interacting in very thoughtful ways with this idea of loyalty, identity. Can you describe a bit of the amazing research you did into undercover operations? I know you spoke with several people to make sure we were getting things accurate in the book.
Sure. So my research process, I mean, it's taken me 10 years to write the book. And so every draft just got better, stronger, deeper, more layered, more nuanced because of the research that I was doing. And so I've conducted interviews with FBI agents, one in particular who is Native and he's retired. And he had so many stories to tell me. And a federal prosecutor, interviews with him, IRS agents. But really the most interesting part of my research was I was able to attend a one-day workshop on making meth that was put on at the State Police Academy. And I received permission to be the only non-law enforcement officer at this training. And so I learned how to make meth. And so I just, research can bring a story to life. It can make it, it can just bring characters to life and just little bits of information that maybe 90% of the people who are reading it, it'll go over their head. But I always think about if there's a law enforcement officer that's reading it and the way that I phrased something or something in a scene, if they can be nodding their head like she got that right, that to me, is, that just is what a researcher would dream of.
I knew you were a passionate author committed to the craft, but when I heard that, I was like, oh, this is next level. And I think that sort of brings us to you were coming up with ideas for twists and turns up until the very end, right? Like we were coming up with like new ways, and you came back with so many brilliant insights, just to twist the knife a little further, just to get that tension sky high. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that aspect of revising, editing. How did you come up with these brilliant twists and turns? How did you figure out when you're going to plant them, when you're going to pull back the curtain, when you're going to shock the reader? I would just love to hear a little bit more insight on that.
Well, I think one thing that I really learned as a writer is I used to write in a very linear fashion, chapter 1 on through, and I would get writer's block. And I don't know why I felt that there was some order that I had to follow instead of just skipping over a difficult scene and picking up at the point where I knew the story needed to be. And then when I finished a draft, I would revise backwards to make sure that the information that is revealed at the end, making sure that I was pacing where the clues were coming in through the story, that it all made sense. So my revision process was this back and forth and hops and skips and everything. But one of my favorite things is, I've been living, breathing, sleeping, dreaming this story for so long. And one of my favorite things that happens is sometimes I will wake up and there's that really brief time in between sleep and wake. And your mind must go to a different place because character insights would come to me, a line of dialogue would just, that maybe I'd been stressing over how to resolve this plot hole, or And the answer would come to me so clearly in that in between moment. And I would just get up and hurry up and get it written down or record. It's easier for me quicker to use a voice recorder because my handwriting, I would look at my handwriting later when I tried writing it in a notebook, and it would just be this like long scribble that trailed off. But so yeah, I would get those ideas down because I really do believe that sometimes the story felt like it was coming from somewhere else, and that I had a lot of help, and anything I could do to help facilitate the story that needed to be told. I felt very strongly about that.
And something you had said in your author's note, after all, storytelling is how we share what it means to be Anishinaabe. I think that dovetails perfectly. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Well, um, in communities and families, it's instead of being told the rules, there stories that illustrate why you don't do this or why it's better to do this. Those stories are more memorable and can have a lasting impact on you. And my father is a firekeeper. So I actually am a firekeeper's daughter. And what a firekeeper does is they strike a fire for ceremonies and other special cultural activities. And there's certain protocols that you have to follow, but also that firekeeper sits around the fire and tells stories. So it's like a great opportunity for a lot of teachings. And so, yeah, my father has been, just a storyteller my whole life about growing up on Sugar Island and leaving as a young man uh, and and stories are how we tell what it means to be Anishinaabe. We have that rich oral history of, stories that have been passed down through generations and that we want to pass on to those generations, our children and our grandchildren. And one thing that comes up in the book is Donis thinks about things in terms of 7 generations. That's one of the teachings that she has. And so one of her epiphanies is about, the FBI is looking to find out who committed the crime, make sure that charges are filed, and then they're off to the next case. And she's like, they're not thinking about what's going to happen to my community when they leave, what's going to happen to children that are impacted by this, what about future generations. I'm the only one who's thinking 7 generations ahead, which is what her elders and other teachers have taught her to do. And so realizing that she's viewing this investigation with totally different eyes than um, than the FBI agents, who are also Native, but their perspective is different. And so that was an interesting part of the story that I liked exploring.
And I think that's certainly what made the story so resonant, so extraordinary. And with this, I think that is the perfect note to wrap things up. That is all the time we have today. I could sit here and listen to you speak for another 5 to 6 hours, but I know you have things to do. But I did want to thank you all for tuning in. You can follow Angeline on Twitter at FineAngeline for more news about Firekeeper's Daughter, and follow Mac Kids School and Library on Twitter at MacKidsSL for more ALA midwinter updates, book news, and more. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the rest of the ALA midwinter meeting.